Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the webinar on placing fearful dogs. I'm Kelley Bollen. So I just wanted to get started by saying thank you to Assisi Animal Health for asking me to give this talk, and also for all the great work that they do to help improve the lives of animals. I, as a behaviorist, am especially grateful for the creation of the Calmer Canine, which helps dogs with separation anxiety as well as other forms of anxiety. And it's really a wonderful tool to have in my own toolbox. And I encourage you guys to get on the Assisi Health website and learn more about the Calmer Canine and how it might be able to help you with some of your shelter dogs that have anxiety issues. So, okay, with that, I would like to just get started and talk about our subject of the day. Now, I'm sure you guys know that the animals we adopt out to people change their lives. Now, hopefully for the good, but sometimes not so much. This is the problem. When we place our fearful dogs, we're so proud of ourselves that we finally got this dog out of the shelter and into a nice, loving home. And we've saved that life, oftentimes from a really bad situation. But sometimes we don't think about how that animal might be changing the adopter's life. And so I really, as a behavior consultant that worked with animal shelters as well as the pet owning public, I like to make sure animal shelters think also about the people who take our animals. Because we can't just think about saving the dog's life. We also need to think about giving the dog the opportunity to be a successful pet and giving the adopter all the information and resources they need to be successful adopters. So we want to remember that the people that come to our shelters come to rescue a dog from homelessness, right? They think they're doing the right thing by coming into our shelter. And they're proud of themselves for choosing this route rather than going to a breeder or a pet store that's, supporting the puppy mill trade. So they deserve to have a good experience by doing this good deed and coming in and adopting one of our animals. So what most adopters are looking for is they're looking for a pet, right? They want a pet. They want a member of the family. They want a dog that they can handle, that they can cuddle with, and a dog that loves them unconditionally. They want a dog that they can walk in the neighborhood without issue. And they want a dog who's accepting and friendly with their visitors. And most importantly, they want a dog that they don't have to worry might bite somebody. So this is what most people want when they come into your shelter. But they're not always getting these things when they adopt out one of our fearful dogs. And so it's critically important for you guys to do some things to ensure that the best possible outcome for these animals is made. First of all, you really need to get to know the dogs. You need to get to know them the best you can in all the different ways that you can, which means trying to get a thorough history, where they came from, what situation they were in, what might have happened to them. And I don't make up stories. Oh, he must have been beaten because he's so fearful. But try to get to know the dogs the best you can from their past, as well as in your shelter, through daily observations and interactions, documenting every interaction people have with that dog. If you implemented behavior modification programs, which you typically want to do with our fearful dogs, how they respond to that behavior modification, just really get to know them the best you can. But then what's really important is to make sure you make good matches with adopters, right? And so it's really important that you don't just give these fearful dogs to just anybody who walks into the shelter and thinks it's cute or feels sorry for the dog. Oftentimes, these are the dogs that are in the back of the run. They look pathetic, they look scared, and people want to save their lives, and good for them. But not everybody's cut out to own a fearful dog. So do good adoption counseling. So, matching these dogs to the right people is one important step. The other important step is to do really good adoption counseling. Now, in my work with animal shelters across the country, I can tell you that I think where we fall short is adoption counseling when it comes to behavior. And I hear all the time from the shelters I work with that, the people don't really listen to you. They just are excited to get the dog. They just want to get home. That's going in one ear and out the other. That doesn't mean we don't give them the information. And especially with our fearful dogs, what I recommend is that people come in a couple of times and spend time with that dog so that they can get to know the dog better. The dog can get to know them, so they're not just going home with a stranger that they just met 15 minutes ago. It's a really good practice to have people come in, meet with the dog a couple of times, and then do, constant adoption counseling with them. Each meeting, you'll be telling them more about the dog and more about how to bring this dog into their lives. You also want to make sure you're providing post-adoption support. Really important, and also another thing that most shelters don't do enough of. Now, I know that many shelters just don't have the time or resources to do post-adoption support for every animal you adopt out, but certainly when you adopt out a fearful dog, it's really important to keep in touch with those adopters. Reach out to them. Don't just say, call us if you have a problem, because most people won't. They'll ask their aunt, they'll Google something. Maybe they'll get good information online and maybe they won't. So being there for them, but also reaching out to them is really important. Reach out, hey, how's it going? How are things, in the home? Have you started taking the dog for a walk yet? Things like that are really important to reach out and help these people. The other thing that's really important, and this is true of really any animal, but especially an animal that we know has any kind of behavioral challenges, especially the fearful ones, accept the returns without judgment. It's really important that you understand that while they thought they could handle having a fearful dog, they never really know until that dog is living in their home. The analogy I make when we're trying to place dogs is, it's kind of like you go to the grocery store and you just randomly pick out somebody to be your life partner and you bring them immediately home to live with you. Now, we would never consider doing that, yet that's what people do when they come to our shelters. Just in a few minutes, maybe a 10-minute meeting, they decide to bring this animal into their home. And so we have to remember that sometimes, even with a couple meetings, even with good adoption counseling, people never know what it's really like to live with a fearful animal. And so if they return that dog, and encourage them that if it doesn't work out, to return the dog to you so that you can get more information about that animal. Because even if that animal was in their home for a day or a week or a month, they know more about that dog than you do now. How that dog is in the home, because how it is in the shelter is going to be different than how it is in the home. So really important, accept those returns without judgment, get a good history when they return that dog so that you can make a better placement the next time, and just don't judge them. So let's talk about matchmaking for a second. So once you know that dog, again, the best way that you can is lots of daily observations, lots of daily interactions, behavior modification strategies for these fearful guys. You need to know how to, a little bit about the adopter, right? So you have to know things like, what are their expectations for a pet dog? What's their schedule like? I mean, are they gone 15 hours a day? What's their experience with dogs? Because a first-time dog parent might not really be ready to have a fearful dog in their home. And what's their desire to work with a dog? These dogs oftentimes need, weeks or months of behavior modification in the home, and they have to understand that. The other important thing is knowing whether they have kids in the home. Oftentimes these fearful dogs were not socialized well to children. We know that young children under 6, are the most vulnerable when we're talking about dogs, being with dogs. Fearful dogs oftentimes can trigger to that fight or flight response. Of course, flight is runaway, but fight is aggressive behavior. And it's often, it's not a malicious intent. It's just that the children put the dog into a situation that makes the dog feel threatened, and the dog triggers to aggressive behavior. So we have to be really careful when we place fearful dogs with children. I usually recommend no kids under 6, and then older kids will have to kind of play it by ear and kind of take a look at those particular children. So let's talk about these fearful dogs in our shelters. So many shelters, in fact, every shelter across the country, take in dogs from situations that are less than ideal for that dog. You take in dogs from abuse cases, whether it's known abuse or not known abuse. Oftentimes we have dogs enter our shelters that have been abused by people. We take in the hoarding cases. Oftentimes, when these big hoarding cases, shelters step up to take the dogs. We take in puppy mill raid dogs too. Again, these big raids, all shelters, they step up and say, we'll take 5 or we'll take 10 or whatever. And then there's the transport program, which has been alive and well for 20 years or more, of moving dogs around the country from places where there's still overpopulation to places where there are not. And oftentimes in places where there's still overpopulation, we have a lot of dogs that are unsocialized to living in a home. And so a lot of times these dogs from these situations are the fearful dogs. And many of them are fearful from one of 3 different things, or all combination of them. Number 1 is a lack of socialization. Remember, the critical period for socialization in dogs is from 3 to 12 weeks. If a dog doesn't get socialized to people and events and living in a home, by the time they're 12 weeks old and going, the critical period ends at 12 weeks, but then we have like up to about 16 weeks that we really need to socialize these puppies. When they don't get socialized, they can be afraid of anything they weren't exposed to. They also might have had some negative experiences. And so again, whether they have been abused or just frightened by people they don't know. And for some of them, fear is a genetic trait, because fear can be genetic. If there's a fearful mom, there's a likelihood that some of her puppies will be fearful, because it can be genetic. There's also a lot of imprinting that goes on with a fearful mom. So if she shows fear to people while she's, raising her puppies, they can learn that people are fearful and this is how you act around them. So all of these things play a role in fear. And you never know when you get a shelter dog what exactly is causing this dog to be fearful. Sometimes we can know their situation and realize they weren't socialized well. Sometimes we know their situation and know they were abused by their owner. But in terms of the genetic component, we really don't know that. And so just remember that all these things play a role in the development of fear in dogs. And many of these dogs have never experienced a fraction of what they are expected to handle in the average home. And so remember, these people bring these animals into their home. They expect to have Lassie, right? They expect to have that pet that they've always wanted. But these animals a lot of times are afraid of people. They're afraid of being inside the house. They're afraid of noises. They're afraid of cars. They have all kinds of different fears. So you want to do careful adoptions, because again, these dogs are not for everyone. It takes a special kind of person to want to take in a fearful dog and listen to what will help that dog best. So first thing is that the adopters need to understand fear. So this is a really important thing in terms of our adoption counseling. They have to understand fear. So they have to understand that fear is an adaptive emotion. That means it helps animals survive. So when an animal has been mistreated or he wasn't socialized, fear helps them survive, because if something's scary, you get away from it as fast as you can. That helps you survive. So fear is adaptive, meaning it's important for survival. And fear is really super powerful. It's one of the most powerful emotions. Really powerful, can override all kinds of other things, right? And fear is not something an animal can control. And so humans can control their fear to a certain degree because we have this big giant cerebral cortex and we can modulate our emotions to a certain extent. So an example, if I look down and I see a spider, I'll startle because it's a spider. That's my limbic system, my emotional center, startling. Then my big giant human brain kicks in and is like, don't be silly, it's just a spider. And I'll go get a little piece of paper and put them outside. But a dog doesn't have this big giant cerebral cortex to override their fear or to explain their fear. So it is out of their control when a dog feels fear. And again, fear can trigger the flight or fight response, right? That's a survival mechanism. The stress response, the flight or fight response is triggered when a dog feels afraid. And that flight response can cause some of these dogs to take off. So many a time, especially dogs that come out of these puppy mill raids or the hoarding cases, they just take off, or, they came off a reservation and they were semi-feral and picked up out living on their own for a while or their whole life. They're going to take off any chance they get. So you have to make sure you counsel your adopters about this fact that they might take off because of that flight response. And they can be gone forever, or it might take days or weeks to catch them. Adopters also need to understand that love alone will not fix the dog and make them normal. The average person thinks this. They really think if they take this dog into their home and love it enough, it will be okay. It will be a normal dog, right? But love alone will not fix these dogs, right? It'll take a long time, months, sometimes even years, for the dog to get used to their new world. One of my worst cases was a semi-feral to feral dog that went into a home of one of my clients. And this dog literally for years had issues. The gentleman who adopted her was, the most wonderful adopter in the world and did everything for this dog. But it really was a lifetime management of this dog. They need to be told to take it really slowly, exposing the dog to people and events with patience, understanding, and lots of yummy treats. They also need to be able to recognize when their dog is afraid. So you have to teach them about body language. You have to teach them what do these signals mean? And because they need to know when their dog is afraid. So give them handouts. There's lots of really great handouts online about body language and signaling that tells the owner that the dog is afraid. They need to recognize when their dog is afraid so they can help them. Teach them about the behaviors that can stem from fear: hiding, escaping, destruction, trembling, salivation, panting, elimination, hypervigilance, vocalizations, pacing, aggression. All these things can come from that fear. Remember, aggression is part of that fight or flight response. And also be careful of your advice. All right, telling the adopter not to reinforce fear by coddling the dog when it's afraid is really, really bad advice, right? Because fear is an emotion and it stems from the limbic system of the brain, that emotional center of the brain. And you can't reinforce an emotion. You can reinforce a behavior, but you can't reinforce an emotion. So the human analogy I make is if you were afraid of flying and your seat partner comforts you and holds your hand and tells you it's okay, does that make you more fearful or does it make you feel better? Of course, it's going to make you feel better. And so you need to support and comfort and protect the fearful dogs. And you have to tell the adopters that they have to do that. They have to be there for that dog. If the dog needs to be picked up, pick the dog up. If the dog needs to be held, hold the dog. Okay, it's really important that they understand you hear it all the time. Don't reinforce fear. You're just making them more fearful. That is not true. Now, many of these dogs are extremely fearful of people because they weren't socialized well, they weren't treated well by people, whatever the case may be. But many of them will bond to at least one person pretty quickly. And that's because dogs are social animals. And as social animals, they need some kind of a bond with another social being, right? And so usually they bond very quickly. Now, oftentimes they bond to the woman in the home before the men in the home, right? It can take a while for them to warm up to other family members, especially men. And it's not because the man in the home that they go to is a nasty man or a bad man. It's just because dogs have what we call stimulus generalization. That means that if something was scary or threatening, be afraid of everything that looks like or reminds you of that scary or threatening thing. Now, I'm not being sexist at all when I say that if somebody's going to be nasty to a dog, it's oftentimes a man. Doesn't mean women aren't abusive to animals. I'm not saying that at all. Oftentimes men are scarier to dogs. And so it can take them longer. And I've had many, many cases where the dog immediately bonds to the woman and is terrified of the husband. And every time the husband comes into the room, the dog like hits the deck, runs out of the room, hides behind the couch. And it's heartbreaking for that man, for sure, because, you know, that guy didn't do anything to that dog. But most do eventually become comfortable in their home and with all of their people. But once that occurs, their fear and their lack of socialization can then drive them to act aggressively to strangers who invade their safety zone, whether it's their house or into their bubble with their owner when they're out on a walk. So oftentimes these fearful dogs can trigger to fear aggression once they've bonded to that family, because they finally feel safe. And anybody they don't know is invading and kind of jeopardizing that safety. And so the owners, the adopters have to understand this. So they have to understand what kind of behavior modification techniques we use to help the fearful dog. So you want to explain to the adopter the concept of systematic desensitization and counter conditioning. So in my language, systematic desensitization is exposing the dog to the scary stimulus at a low level and gradually increasing the stimulus strength over time until that dog learns to accept that thing without as much fear. Counter conditioning is changing the emotional response to a scary stimulus from negative to positive by pairing the scary stimulus with something the dog loves. Typically, we use really yummy food. Now, we put these two things together, and that's how we work with these fearful dogs. Now, you wouldn't use this terminology with our adopter. In regular language, you need to tell them, you need to expose your new dog to things that he or she is afraid of very slowly and patiently, and pair the sight of the scary thing with something that dog absolutely loves. Usually meat is the best. All right, also give them handouts. This is a handout I used to give to all of my clients that I was working on counter conditioning, just a pictorial so they understand what we're talking about. The dog has a negative emotional response to a trigger. If we pair that trigger with meat, pretty soon the dog feels differently about that trigger. And so sometimes people just need to see it in a picture. Counter conditioning to visitors or strangers. So all visitors and strangers need to predict great things. So once that dog is used to the family, now we got to counter condition the dog's emotional response to visitors and strangers. So, but the treats need to come from the owner. So oftentimes people give their visitors the treats and say, here, just give them to the dog. But now we have in the dog's mind, a scary monster holding their favorite treat. It's like, here's a monster, he's holding your favorite candy bar. Do you approach the monster to get the candy bar? Or do you say, you know what, it's not worth it? And that's what happens to dogs too. So the treats have to come from the owner. The visitor or stranger should not force themselves on the dog. In fact, they should ignore the dog. Don't look at the dog, don't talk to the dog, and sit or stand sideways so they're not as threatening. So the dialogue they should have with their visitors about their visitors. Whenever you have a visitor, make sure you have plenty of little chunks of meat. Keep the dog next to you and ask the visitor to ignore the dog, and then give the dog a piece of the meat every time she's brave enough to look over at the visitor. Now, after a while, if the dog starts seeming okay, you can have the visitor toss the treats to the dog, but the dog should never be forced to go close to that visitor. And the same with strangers out on a walk. Whenever you take the dog for a walk, carry a little bag with chunks of meat. Every time you see a person at a distance, give the dog a piece of the meat. right? And if somebody wants to come up and meet the dog, ask them not to come too close, turn their body sideways, don't give the dog eye contact. And then you, the owner, needs to feed the dog the pieces of the meat. So again, it's important that the positive reinforcement, the meat, comes from the owner. Now, if you're not prepared to be brave enough to tell people not to approach your dog, then that's going to be a problem. So you have to tell people, they have to be brave enough to tell people she's scared of people she doesn't know. Can you not come too close? Some of these dogs have other handling and fears and sensitivities, like being reached to be petted or having body parts touched. So to use systematic desensitization and counter conditioning for these things, let's talk about reaching to pet the dog. So you start getting the dog used to you handing them a treat, and then you add a second hand. So as you hand them the treat, the second hand comes with it. And then you slowly raise that second hand higher and higher until the dog is pairing getting a treat with the hand coming over their head. Now, we know petting a dog over their head is not a good idea, but that's how everybody pets their dog. So it'd be really worth it for the adopter to get that dog used to it. If they have a sensitive body part, because they weren't socialized to all their body parts being touched, right? So again, you start by touching a non-sensitive body part while delivering the treat and slowly work towards that sensitive body part while delivering the treat. This is systematic desensitization and counter conditioning. Now, there are some helpful products that can also help dogs with fear. There's all kinds of natural calming supplements. Now, there's tons of stuff out on the market. I like to give adopters, an idea of some of the veterinary approved products that are not prescription, like the ones you see here on the picture, in the picture, and just have that nice list for them. The adaptable pheromone collar can be really great. The thunder shirt can be helpful for these guys because that constant pressure on the sensory receptors can calm the nervous system. And so the thunder shirt can be very helpful. And some of these dogs can actually need medication, but that would have to be coordinated with a veterinarian, of course, some anti-anxiety medication. And of course, we have our calmer canine. And so the calmer canine, the research on the calmer canine, which I'd love for you guys to look into, was on separation anxiety. But, they have found, Assisi has found that it helps with all kinds of anxieties. And I think the calmer canine is a great tool to help our fearful guys that come out of the shelter. Now, we can have some of these that are sheltered to get the dog started, and then of course recommend them to the adopter. So it can really help. And I urge you to look into this so that you can understand how that calmer canine works, because it's just really an amazing tool. So you got to remember, it's not just about saving the dog's life. You also need to think about giving that dog the opportunity to be a successful pet and giving the adopter all of the information and resources they need to be successful adopters. Remember, if the adopter has a bad experience with their adopted dog, they might never consider adopting again. And they're going to tell all of their friends how difficult it was. And so, I've had many clients who say, I just can't do it. It's just too much. I feel sorry for my dog every day. It's just too much for me to deal with. Or again, some of those situations where, the husband, who is a loving, sweet man, the dog never gets over the fear of the husband. And I've had heartbreaking consults with people like that. And, they finally have to give up the dog because it's not fair to the husband or the dog. And so it's really hard. So make sure you counsel these people really well. Make sure they know what they're getting themselves into. Make sure you do great adoption counseling, have them meet the dog several times, and set that dog and those adopters up for success. Our goal is to save more dogs, but we have to consider the adopter too, because they're the ones we rely on to come in and adopt our shelter dogs. So do the best you can to give them all the information they need to be successful.